Evening, everybody, to this meeting of the Republican Labour Education Forum. We are delighted to have Dr. Andrea Pisauro here to talk to us about the murder of Giacomo Matteotti. I hope I've said that correctly, and of course to link that to republicanism and the fascism of Mussolini. I'm going to go straight over to Phil Vellender to introduce Dr. Pisauro to us. Over to you, Phil.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. This isn't a practice. Yes, Andrea and I met a while ago, back in the days of the Brexit debate on various demonstrations. And it turned out that Andrea was involved with this Giacomo Matteotti project. And as someone who is well aware of the context, I felt it was really an excellent idea to invite him to come. Andrea is interested in lots of things. He has many research interests, and I'm not going to detain you longer by discussing those, because I'm sure he'll be working them into his talk. But it's enough to say that some of you may not yet have read any books on Mussolini or recently, and I'm sure Andrea will suggest a reading list, which perhaps we can, if we aren't able tonight, we can put it into the chat. I'll also remind you that John Foote was due to come and see us, but he was unwell, and Andrea, in a sense, has stepped in, and John will be joining us to talk about Mussolini again in the new year, probably later after Easter. To allow time for this one to have a bit of space. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Andrea. If that's okay, everybody in? That's great. Okay, then.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Phil, and to all of you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to speak to you. And I have prepared some slides because I think that talking about history without seeing something is always a bit complex. And so I'll start by sharing my screen. And can you all see a big face of Matteotti?
That's fine.
Fantastic. So I wanted to put a picture there, and there is going to be a number of pictures of Matteotti because partly it's where my story starts. I need to say from the beginning is that I'm not an historian. I am a researcher. I study psychology and neuroscience, but I'm also very fascinated by history, and I am also a political activist. And Matteotti brings together the political activism and the interest in history for me. And I'm going to explain in a moment why and how I got involved in a number of projects related to the memory of Matteotti. So I'll start from a little summary of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start by telling you why Matteotti is important for me, and I believe it should be important for all of us. I will say something about Matteotti, Italian socialism and republicanism, which I can imagine is of interest to you all. And I will conclude with a very brief story of how, from Matteotti's murder, Italy lost its democracy in 1924, because these two events, the murder and the end of the Italian democracy, are strongly intertwined. So I'll start from tell you my personal story of how we got involved in Matteotti's projects. And this story really starts with another picture of Matteotti. So this is a picture that my dad hold on above his desk in his office for a long time. And really, I can say that in many Italian houses for many years, you were likely to encounter Matteotti serious gaze, this strong expression, this person with conviction that you can see in many of his pictures. And this was true in my house as well. My mom and my dad were both socialists. They met during 1968. For them, they had very serious political discussions about all sorts of things. Most often they disagreed, but they didn't disagree on Matteotti. Matteotti was unifying my family and beyond my family, all anti-fascists in Italy think Matteotti is a founding father of anti-fascism. And I'm going to explain why in a second. I also want to mention, because it was part of my biography, that I was born on the 10th of June 1984, which was incidentally 60 years after the murder of Matteotti. That was on the 10th of June 1924, which had a very practical implication for me, that every time my birthday came, there was someone talking about Matteotti. And so I came to associate my celebrations with the memory of this figure. And of course, partly because of these things that I just told you, he had a profound influence on my political identity. And not just me, of course, and I'm going to talk about a number of other people that were inspired by Matteotti. And I will start by a tale of three referenda. We are all familiar with a lot of the stuff that happened in Britain with referendum recently, but I'm gonna start with a different referendum, which was the 2016 Italian constitutional referendum, which was a referendum brought forward by the government of Matteo Renzi. Matteo Renzi was the prime minister of Italy back then, and you can describe him in short as a charismatic version of Keir Starmer. That lacks charisma, but other than that, they are kind of centrist and very moderate. And his constitutional reform was very controversial, and I was strongly against it, partly because it was reducing the powers of parliament and increasing the power of government. So I invited to London this man called Felice Besostri, who was an Italian socialist lawyer who became famous in Italy because he fought for parliamentary democracy, arguing against the constitutional reform that I just described, and also against a number of electoral laws that were passed in Italy, which were trying to reduce the proportional representation in favor of a first past the post approach. So in Italy, there are people arguing for a British model. Felice Besostri was the strongest proponent of an alternative model of proportional representation. And I mention him because really the story starts with him. Unfortunately, he died this year, so I'm very sad because I cannot say that he's still fighting with us, but it's important partly because of another story. You will all remember that in 2016 there was also the Brexit referendum, and 3 years later there was an infamous prorogation of Parliament proposed by Boris Johnson. And at the time, Felice got in touch with me together with a group of Italian lawyers to tell me, partly because I was involved in some of this anti-Brexit demonstration together with Phil and many of you. So Besostri told me, you know that Matteotti, 100 years ago, fought against the prorogation of the Italian parliament by the king. And there is a very useful lessons and precedents that you can draw from the Italian case to argue against the prorogation of the British parliament by Boris Johnson. And so that was interesting. I wrote about it in a number of articles, and together with many people, including, I believe, all of you, we fought against that prorogation, which was unlawful and deemed unlawful by the court. But that started a conversation around Matteotti's role in defending parliamentary democracy. And it was a conversation that, of course, had a long history, because if I am talking about referendum, I also need to mention that a very famous referendum was what ended monarchy in Italy. It was the 1946 Italian institutional referendum, a choice between republic and monarchy. And the Italian socialists that fought against prorogation in the 1920s, together with communists and other republicans, defeated the monarchy in that referendum with a significant margin. So there was here a political tradition of Italian democratic socialism that defended parliamentary prerogatives against the government and the monarchy. And this link between me and Besostri is also what brought to the beginning of a number of collaboration relating to Matteotti. Because thanks to Besostri, the Fondazione Giacomo Matteotti, which is the institution that remembers Matteotti in Italy, got in touch with me in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic because they asked me if I could help comparing documents on the proceedings over Matteotti's murder for the 100th anniversary. Because in 2024, it was 100 years since Matteotti was killed by Mussolini, and I'm gonna talk about it in a moment about the murder. But basically, in 2024, it was the 100th anniversary. There was a strong sense that anti-fascist Italians had to honor the legacy of Matteotti. And the Matteotti Foundation was concerned with a number of documents which were in London and were brought to London by another famous Italian anti-fascist called Gaetano Salvemini, who was exiled to London in the years of the 1920s when fascists started. He was a leading anti-fascist in London. He was a friend of a number of intellectuals and even of the former Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. He was the director of a newspaper that was published abroad called Non Mollare, which was very much calling for justice over Matteotti's murder. And among the other things he did, this Salvemini, he brought to LSE crucial documents that were the documents relating to the proceedings over Matteotti's murder. They were brought to London between December 26 and January 27. This is a screenshot from the Westminster Gazette that talks about secret document that it's the only copy and is arrived at LSE. It was documents that contained evidence from witnesses that took part in the trial over Matteotti's murder. I'm going to give you more details shortly. And they were very dangerous for the Italian government because in these documents you could find very strong implications that Mussolini was behind the assassination. And because of that, these documents were kept in a safe at LSE. The day after they arrived to LSE, there was a mysterious attempt to open this safe. It's not known exactly what happened, but it's known that Mussolini was writing to the Italian embassy in London, trying to understand what was in this document, because, of course, he was trying to defend himself by the accusation, and he was trying to do something about these documents. So I started comparing these documents with the originals that were kept in Italy. And I don't have time to discuss why, but you need to trust me on the word. The documents in Italy, for 70 years, no one could look at them for a very abstruse law. So it's only very recently that they started, scholars started to look at these documents in Italy. And very, very recently, a comparison between the documents in London and documents in Italy was attempted to check that there was no differences. But for me, it was the beginning of a journey because I started to kind of immerse myself into the story of the murder. By the way, I want to credit Alice Gustoni, who is the most significant historian of Gaetano Salvemini in the UK. Then this year, in 2024, of course, it was the 100th anniversary of the murder. And so together with many friends in the Italian progressive community, we founded the Matteotti Committee London that organized a number of events to remember Matteotti. And we did it specifically in London, partly because of this important fact that the documents over the murder are at LSE, and we organized the first public display of the archive of these documents that I studied. But we also honored on the Italian Liberation Day the fact that 100 years ago, on the 25th of April, Matteotti was actually in London. His very last trip abroad was to London. It was again a symbolic coincidence that 25th of April is also the year in which, the day in which, in 1945, Italy was liberated by fascists. So you have 25th of April 1924, Matteotti in London, and 25th of April 1945, fascism is finally defeated. And among the things that we try to remember about this visit was we organized an exhibition which was curated by Alfio Bernabei in this palace near Trafalgar Square, which was the headquarters of the Fascist Party in London, and is now been liberated by any fascist influence and hosted an exhibition about Matteotti. And of course, in Italy, there was a lot of commemorations. This is the picture of the President of the Italian Republic, Sergio Mattarella, honoring Matteotti in the place where he was kidnapped, on the Lungotevere, near in Rome. So Tevere is the river of Rome, and it was a very solemn moment of celebrations, among many others that I don't have time to talk about. So you can understand that Matteotti has been part of the last 2 years of my life very intensely for series of initiatives and activities of research. But now let me tell you something about very basic information about Italian socialism and republicanism, and where Matteotti fits in all this. By the way, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I can only see a few of you, but you can also use the chat if there is anything you want to ask. So Matteotti was born in 1885 from a wealthy family in agrarian Veneto, in the northeast of Italy. You can see a picture of his house. You can tell it's a nice house. They were quite well off. They have a number of land in the northeast, his family. The town was called Fratta Polesine. It was a very poor land. People were working in the fields. There was a lot of farmers, and Matteotti feels for these farmers. There were very poor conditions in which people were working. And so when he was just 13, he joins the Socialist Party. It was, if you want, a choice against his class. But nevertheless, he was out of strong convictions, and he started to attend party meetings and becomes quite vocal and visible in the local community as someone that was capable of arguing politically. He studies law and travels to the UK for the first time in 1910 when he comes to Oxford, because he wanted to compare Italian and English law. So he learns also to speak English when he's quite young. He becomes quite vocal against World War One. World War One caught Italy completely unprepared and completely split between different camps. The Italian socialists were even more split. At the time in which World War One started, Mussolini was in the Socialist Party. He was the director of the socialist newspaper L'Avanti. And on the pages of L'Avanti, Mussolini advocates for Italians' entry into World War One, whereas Matteotti is strongly against it. And that's the first time that these two men started to conflict very strongly. The rest of the Socialist Party is kind of on the fence a bit. They are not in favor of the war, but they don't want to sabotage it either. Whereas Matteotti was really calling for an insurrection against the entry into war. Anyway, he becomes a national figure at the time, and when the war ends, he becomes a socialist MP for the first time. He's elected in 1919 and re-elected in 1921 and 1924. And in 1922, he becomes also the secretary of the Unitary Socialist Party. and he was. And I'm going to explain what it was in a moment, but he becomes a national figure. He's a secretary of a party in the Italian parliament. So he's not a lonely MP, but he's someone of significance. Now, unfortunately, to tell you a bit about the conflicted history of Italian socialism, because it's very relevant for the story of Matteotti, for understanding his legacy. So Italian Socialist Party was founded in Genova in 1892. Since 1985, it's called the Italian Socialist Party. This is a very famous picture of the so-called fourth state, the proletariat that is advancing, that was in every section of the party across the country. After the war, there is the Russian Revolution in 1917, and the Italian Socialists split. There is a conference in Livorno, and out of a significant split, the Italian Communist Party was born. So it was a major split of the Italian left. Out of it, there are three major blocks: the new Communist Party of Gramsci, the Italian Socialist Party that had the formal continuity, which was kind of on the fence between whether to join the Bolsheviks or not, and a fraction which was pro-democracy and against the revolution, which was called the Unitary Socialist Party. And this is the one that Matteotti joins. You can see that on the symbol there is the word libertà, freedom, because they were in favor of freedom and democracy. Matteotti joins this party, but is trying to mend fences, at least with the socialists on the fence, and is not hostile to the communists. He's a unitary figure. He's trying to unite the left as much as he can. But of course, this split is very significant, and he lasted for several decades afterwards. One thing that was uniting this divided left, at least, was that the fact that they were all Republicans. Italy had as a king Vittorio Emanuele III of Savoia. He had been king since 1900. He was quite popular, his family in the north, but not really in the south of Italy, and not in Rome. This was because of the peculiarity of how Italy was unified, and the Savoia went from Piemonte. So, you know, it was not super popular ever. The king has a very important role in pushing Italy to join the war in World War I. He gains some popularity then because he goes to the front together with the soldiers. Of course, not quite fighting, but you know, he's a visible presence among the soldiers. And that creates a situation in which Italy becomes more in favor of monarchy. The socialists remain Republican. All the different split of the Socialist Party advocate for a republic, although their narrative is probably less anti-monarchical during and after the war, because the king was becoming more popular. But it's important that they remain Republican, and we'll see why in a moment. Of course, we cannot talk about Matteotti without mentioning the rise of fascism and the 1924 elections. Now, you probably all know that Benito Mussolini was rising after the World War I in Italy. He founded the Fasci di Combattimento in 1919 in Milan, and 2 years later, the Fascist National Party. What were these fascists doing? They were exerting violence and intimidation against workers. It was a revolutionary period in Italy. There were strikes, revolts, workers wanted more, and the fascists were using violence to suppress any attempt to bring about social change. But crucially, Mussolini did not have a strong electoral support. In the 1921 elections, despite becoming popular with the right, with the landowners, with the factory owners, the national bloc, where the fascists are present, only got 19% of the vote, and they were together with the right-wing liberals, whereas the socialists were at 25%. So, you know, much lower than what Trump has now. Despite this, very controversially, in October 1922, there was a political crisis in Rome, and Mussolini organizes this march on Rome to end the political stasis and find a solution. And the king should have stopped the march on Rome of thousands and thousands of fascists. There was ready for him to sign a document that would have called for the stato d'assedio, and he could have called the police to block these people. Instead, he decided to call Mussolini to become prime minister. And of course, that's a very crucial moment in Italian history, because Mussolini enters into the Palace of Power. He will never get out of it for more than 20 years. And the first thing that he does when he's in power, he changes the electoral law. And he makes the electoral law more like a first past the post, more majoritarian. He gives a huge majority prize to the first list. And not only that, it increases the level of violence. The level of violence that he was exerting out of parliament start to become the violence of the state over workers. And here we come to the 1924 elections. These are the crucial elections which really determines the fate of Matteotti and the fate of Italian democracy. These were elections which were absolutely characterized by violence, the government was preventing candidates to stand, preventing candidates to speak in squares. The electoral campaign could not really exist in many parts of the country. Because of that, the nationalists of Mussolini got an enormous amount of votes, but we cannot trust this result. We know for a fact that the results were not fair. But we do know that in the north, where there was more of a control of the left on the election, the three different fragments of the left get some votes. These are the results. You can see that the PSU, the party of Matteotti, was the one that was stronger. It was 6%. We are talking about small percentages, but again, don't trust these numbers. The real numbers were very different. Italians were not allowed to vote freely. But there you go. So this is the last instance of Italian democracy. And that brings me to the last part of my presentation. The link between Matteotti's murder and the end of Italian democracy in 1924. I start from Matteotti's visit to London, because it's probably quite crucial to understand the reason why he was killed. Matteotti arrives in London on the 22nd of April, 1924. He's on a secret mission as part of a European tour. He also goes to Brussels, to Paris, and a few other places. And it's a secret mission. He did not tell anyone, not even his collaborators. He didn't even have a passport, because the government had blocked his passport because they feared him. And we don't quite know how he gets to exit Italy in that distance. But we do know that at the time, Ramsay MacDonald was the first ever Labour Prime Minister, and also the first socialist leader in Europe. So it was important for him to go to London, and he makes it a central part of his visit. He spends 4 days in London that time. One reason why he goes there is because he wanted to find an English publisher for a book detailing the crimes of the Mussolini government. This was this book here that you can see, The Fascists Exposed, A Year of Fascist Domination, where Matteotti details all crimes of fascists across Italy. And there were really hundreds and hundreds of workers, socialists, that were killed, that were purged, that were beaten. And he collects all this information. It's an enormous testimony of all the crimes of fascists. No one else attempted something so comprehensive, so detailed. And he wanted to publish it abroad, because he wanted to tell the world the new fascist government is really something terrible. People didn't know yet. He was, somebody that was talked highly in certain circles, particularly among the conservatives. So he goes to London to publish this book, and also to meet Labour, Independent Labour, Socialist International, the Trades Union Congress. He wanted to raise the alarm. specifically wanted to denounce fascism as threat to democracy of international significance and to call for moral and material assistance. And we know this because in the Labour Archive we have documents about this meeting, and it was very clear what Matteotti was asking. Among historians, there is also some suggestions that while he was in London, he got some proofs of fascist corruption over an oil deal. At the time, we are talking about 1920s, oil was not that important. It was growing. There were a lot of people that were interested in Italian potential for oil. And the Mussolini's government was negotiating with an American company to give access to the Italian oil. And of course, in Britain, many people were not happy about it. We know that Winston Churchill had interest in the oil business at the time. And some suggestions are that Matteotti got some documents from Churchill's circles about this evidence of corruption by the Americans on the fascist government, but we don't know. What we do know is that when Matteotti comes back to Rome on the 30th of May 1924, he gives a very famous speech to denounce the April 24 election results. As I said, these were elections marred by violence, and in Parliament, he speaks for a long time. He gives a long list of facts, people, and places where these elections were not free and were marred by violence. And he does that for almost an hour while he's constantly interrupted, shouted at, insulted by more than 300 fascist MPs. The chronicles of the newspapers the following day are very eloquent in how much the climate was tense in Parliament. As soon as he ends his speech, he goes to talk to a colleague called Giovanni Cosattini, and apparently he told him, I've done my speech, now you need to prepare my commemoration. So he kind of felt that the level of threat from the fascists was such. And in the audience that day, there were also these two guys, Cesare Rossi, who was the director of Mussolini Press and Propaganda Office, very close aide of Mussolini, probably his most important advisor, and Amerigo Dumini. Amerigo Dumini was the head of Mussolini political police. This was a secret political police that Italians were not aware of, but they were acting on people on the opposition, beating them up, going and punishing anyone that Mussolini didn't like. And this is an extract of a newspaper on the 21st of June that mentioned that Cesare Rossi and Amerigo Dumini are talking they are standing in Parliament. They are not MPs, they are where the public was. And they are saying that with people like Matteotti, you cannot use words, you need to use guns. This was referring this, and it was that these were threats to be taken very seriously. So what happens then? 10 days later, on the 10th of June, Matteotti is kidnapped while he's on his way to Parliament. He's kidnapped in broad daylight at 4:30. 5 men, led by Dumini, wait in a car. The car looked like that. You can see the picture. It was a very fancy car at the time. Cars were in the 20s. You couldn't see many cars with cover. It was quite an expensive model. And it was the car of the director of a fascist newspaper called Corriere Italiano. It was called Filippo Filippelli. And several witnesses report a movie-like abduction, like these 5 men stopping Matteotti while he walks in the street, bringing by force into the car. He drops his parliamentary ID. There was some kids playing that look at it, some other people coming from the river, they see it, some see it from the window. Unfortunately, no one does anything to stop it. The car sped away and Matteotti would never be seen alive again. You can see here the picture of the road where Matteotti was kidnapped. This is there is the river here, the Tevere, and this is a few days later. A lot of people were there because it became a famous place immediately. So what happens then? Well, the murderers, we know from the inquest, from the documents that are LSE and other sources, came back to the Corriere Italiano, the newspaper, with the car. And the same car was seen the day before the murder on Palazzo Chigi, the head of the government where Mussolini was staying, and on the Viminale, which was the home office where Cesare Rossi was staying. So this same car, it was a car which was circulating among the palaces of power. The following day is already something very revealing about what really happened. We know now that Rossi and Mussolini learned about the murder in the very early hours of the morning. We know that Belia Matteotti, who was Matteotti's wife, reports the disappearance of Matteotti to Modigliani, who was another MP, a best friend of Matteotti. Modigliani goes to the police, but the police already knows about the kidnapping because they heard it from fascist MPs. And at this point, Italy still doesn't know. Italy discovers the abduction only 2 or 3 days later when the newspaper starts talking about it. History sometimes is determined by small episodes, something that is not foreseeable. And when Matteotti was killed, he could have gone like this. No evidence, no one knows what happened. There was no one has seen the car anymore. But something had happened for which the kidnappers were unaware. The car registration number was reported to the police at 1:30 on the 12th. And this triggers a chain of events because now the thing is public. The police knows that they know the registration number. From the registration number, they can go back to the director of the newspaper. From the director of the newspaper, they could go also to Dumini, that was working at the newspaper. And so it's a problem. So Mussolini is now scared. But it wasn't meant to be. It wasn't part of the plan. Matteotti should have disappeared without any evidence. He goes to Parliament and in a rush he releases a statement trying to reassure MPs that he's trying to look for Matteotti. He's pretending to be very concerned. He even asked to see the wife of Matteotti the following day to tell her, to reassure her that he's doing as much as he can to retrieve her husband. Of course, we know now that when he was doing these things, when he was telling Parliament and the wife that Matteotti, that they were searching for Matteotti, Matteotti was already dead. He knew he was dead, and he knew he was killed by his own men. He goes even further because Dumini is arrested because of these circumstances that are a bit complicated to explain in details. And Mussolini starts to describe the crime as diabolical. He starts to blame it on someone that wanted to create a crisis against him. He started to present it as a plot from his opponents. And he blames it on Rossi. He asks him to resign. His closest aide, his most important collaborator, he tells him to resign because he tried to pinpoint the blame on him. Of course, no one believes it. In fact, the judge that were investigating on the case appoint a guy called Del Giudice, which is quite fun in Italian because Del Giudice means the judge, but it was called like that. And this judge immediately started to call for the arrest of the closest aides of Mussolini. He's closing the circle. He's very determined to investigate what has happened. In fact, he wanted to investigate all crimes of Mussolini. The Matteotti is the final straw. Del Giudice wants to go after the government. And here comes the problem with republicanism. Because the opposition, of course, is outraged. Italy is outraged. People are in the streets. They are screaming. They are bringing roses to the place where Matteotti is kidnapped. So the opposition wants to do something, and they make what is deemed a crucial mistake by historians, because they chose to do what is remembered as the Aventino secession. So they decided to quit parliament, to withdraw from parliament in protest at Matteotti's disappearance. And this really was an attempt to pressure the king, Vittorio Emanuele III, to dismiss Mussolini. And the problem, historians still don't know exactly why it didn't happen, because obviously it was quite clear that people close to Mussolini were behind the murder. So the king could have acted, but many historians believe that the king did not act because he feared the Republican opposition more than the fascist government. And that's probably something that we need to discuss in terms of what he meant, why monarchy sometimes can take horrible decisions just to preserve their role. I very briefly want to mention this article because it's quite something. Matteotti is dead on the 10th of June 1924, but on July 1924, an article from Matteotti is published in London on a magazine called English Life, which was a response to Mussolini that had published an article on the previous issue of the journal. Now, English Life was a newspaper edited by Brendan Bracken. Is a name that many of you might know. He was the closest aide of Winston Churchill. He was also the Minister of Information during World War II and was also possibly the inspiration to George Orwell to name the Big Brother. But nevertheless, you need just to know that last thing that Matteotti writes is in London, is on this newspaper, and it contains very strong accusation of corruption to the government and very strong accusation to the fascism in general, with this prediction, which turned out to be true, that fascists will make Italy infamous throughout the world. That's the very ending of the article. But then, where are we in Italy? The pressure on the government is still building. The king hasn't quite made a decision. The opposition is raising the case. People are protesting in the street. The government wants to show that it's doing something. So they make the skeleton reappear. The corpse of Matteotti is found. Is found allegedly by a carabiniere just after Ferragosto. Ferragosto is the middle of August, where Italians are all at the sea or at home resting. No one is working. And we suspect very strongly, but we don't have super strong evidence, is that this was a retrieval orchestrated by the government to show goodwill and to delay the investigation. Because, when the corpse is found, then the judge needs to investigate, he needs to ask the carabiniere to come to witness, need to ask whoever was in the area. He loses a couple of months just going after these people. And of course, Ferragosto was convenient for the government because the attention was minimized because Italians were at the sea. Even though Italian attention was minimized, the coffin is carried overnight to keep minimizing attention. The funeral is rushed through, yet thousands of people go to the funeral. It was extremely emotional, the moment. A few weeks pass, and I'm coming to the end of the presentation. Filippelli, the director of the newspaper, and Rossi, the closest aide of Mussolini, published their memoirs. And their memoirs are consistent with a picture of other key accounts, of which Italians were not aware because they were in the inquest, but they were not public. But the picture that emerged is clear. Mussolini gave the order to kill Matteotti. And Mussolini is very scared because he knows that they start to build up the evidence. And so he decides to end Italian democracy. On the 3rd of January 1925, he goes to parliament. He gave a very famous speech, which will be 100 years old in a few weeks, where he says that if fascism has been a criminal association, if all the violence has been the results of a determined historical, political, and moral delinquency, the responsibility for this is on me. And then he challenges parliament, in which there were only fascist MP, because the opposition had abandoned parliament 6 months earlier. He challenged parliament to investigate him if they don't trust him. Of course, fascists approve with enthusiasm, and he so ends the speech saying, in the next 48 hours, I will pass new law, it's going to be a new situation. And Italian democracy is over. Parties are dismantled, demonstrations are prohibited, newspapers are shut. Meanwhile, there was also the trial that has started. There was this anti-fascist judge that I showed you the picture of. Well, he is removed. An amnesty is passed for political crimes. The trial is moved to a small city in the east of Italy, which was very fascist. Everyone is acquitted. You can see, to understand the climate, these were the people in prison waiting for the trial. This is Dumini, and in prison they were given champagne, food. They were having a good life because the government was on their side. So the trial is a farce, and Velia Matteotti, the wife of Matteotti, famously said, "I did not have justice from men, I will have it from history and from God." So, to conclude, Matteotti's murder was one of the most consequential political assassinations in modern European history. Countless authoritarian regimes, from Hitler to Putin, were inspired by the action of Mussolini in physically killing the opposition. Yet, Mussolini's responsibility was never fully accepted by a lot of people in Italy, by the Italian institutional right, including the government of Giorgia Meloni. And Matteotti remains a ghost. He's never been talked by those people. And he's still a figure that is not universally revered. The motive of the murder remains a source of debate to date. The socialist tradition maintains that it was a political murder. They wanted to kill the leader of the opposition. Another current of historians believe that this evidence of corruption was what was really scaring Mussolini. My personal perspective is that it was quite important also Matteotti internationalism, because he came to London, he was talking to comrades across Europe, and Mussolini very much feared this possibility that anti-fascism would spread around Europe. And so really what this research is about is to pay tribute to a European martyr of democracy. And I think it's quite important that we do this now, because democracy is getting weaker, and we really need to do our best to defend democracy in the 21st century. I wanted to put a picture of Trump, but then I didn't have the force to put Trump next to Matteotti, so I didn't do it. But I want to use the slogan of people in Germany that are in the streets against Alliance for Germany. Nie wieder ist jetzt. Now is the time to raise these points and to honor this figure. Thank you very much.
That was absolutely fascinating. And to think that I didn't even know the name until a couple of weeks ago. Wonderful, wonderful talk, Dr. Pisauro. Thank you so much. And I think my first thought is, what a brave man. You know, he knew what was going to happen, and he went ahead and made that speech to Parliament anyway. What a brave man. I already have hands up for the Q&A, so I'm going to go straight away to Mike Hope to ask the first question. If you have a question or you'd like to, start a discussion or you have a contribution, please do raise your hands. Particularly as Andrea said, the role of the monarch in all of this is very, very frightening, and something as Republicans we need to think about. So I'm going to go to Mike first. Mike.
Well, thank you, Andrea. That was indeed amazing, and many bits of the story I didn't know at all. You know, typically we know a little bit about Mussolini's march on Rome, but not some of the political divisions that existed. And it's about that I want to ask my question, really, because I notice there is no mention in your accounts subsequent to you looking at the left divided three ways between the PG, the communists, the PC, the socialists, and then his own particular form of libertà socialism. What did, I mean, while there was considerable and growing support for Mussolini, it was a long way, particularly in the working class areas of the North, a long way from unanimous. There were a very significant support for socialists and communists. So what did the PG do? What did the other socialists do? I mean, from your account, it sounds like they did nothing, but I cannot believe that.
Well, so first of all, I would say this. There were bad relationships between left-wing parties in the 1924 elections. They were all in competition with each other. So it wasn't the best of climate. This said, Matteotti's murder really unified the whole opposition. So when I briefly mentioned the Aventino secession, when all the opposition abandoned parliament, that included all three segments of the left. So they came to a unity of strategy. It is fair to add that the communists were not very much on board with the Aventino. They wanted to call a general strike, and they were critical of the parliamentary handling of the crisis. They thought that it was not enough. But I also need to mention that they were not very good with Matteotti in some ways, in the sense that the 1924 general election campaign was a campaign in which the communists were not very much in favor of democracy, and there was a strong polemic against the Italian Unitary Socialist Party. So these divisions certainly had an impact, but I would say that the largest problem was certainly the king, because if the entire opposition, and this included the left, but also the Popular Party, the liberals, if they are all united, they all abandon parliament, and they all ask you to take a stance, and you don't take it, it's the king that is to blame, not any single faction of the Progressive Front. And very briefly, I also want to mention, relating to the courage of Matteotti, I didn't have time to mention it, but before being kidnapped the day he was killed, he had been kidnapped also 3 years earlier in 1921 by a group of fascists in his own constituency. So they had beaten him up for hours, and they released it afterwards. So he really knew what he was going towards, in a very physical sense. But yeah, so the left was divided, and I don't think we can blame it on those divisions, though, as I said.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrea. I haven't noticed any hands up at the moment. Phil, you put a question into the chat. Do you want to ask that question?
Well, my question will probably come a bit later, after everyone else, really, because I was thinking of talking about the fate of the PC after war, which I think would be interesting, because it might be enlightening just to see how this Mussolini period connects with post-war Italian politics, and especially how the PSI declined very rapidly after in the 1990s. And some of us might be a bit surprised, because they had a hell of a lot of support in the 80s, 70s and 80s. They had 15% of the vote, and then suddenly they disappeared. But I was going to leave that question until later. But it might be worth just thinking about you know, the Republican sentiment in the period when Mussolini was gaining power, how strong were the Republicans as opposed to the Socialists? I mean, I know that they had representation. They represented the workers in the peasantry and in Ravenna, and they were also strong on the coast, on the Adriatic coast. I just thought you might like to say a little bit more about that, if you can. Thank
Yes,
you.
so in relation to the Republican sentiment after the First World War, I would think that was best expressed by the actions by socialists, including Matteotti in parliament, to fight against the prorogation, to fight against the prerogatives of the king. But I think that it was not a major element of campaigning that socialists were doing in the country. It was not the most popular of issue for workers that were struggling with the bread and butter issues, but they were all Republicans. So I think he played a role in at least the skepticism of the king. Talking about the decline of the Socialist Party after World War II is another very complex piece of history. I would probably just say a couple of words at the end if there is time, but I would stay on the talk for now. And I see there are a few hands that are raised.
Yes, yes, we've got 3 hands up now. So I'm going to bring in Peter and then Tim and then Steve. Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, very, very interesting presentation. As others have said, I've not got any knowledge about Italy and Italian fascism, which is to my detriment, not to anybody else's. But it goes to show that, you know, on our doorstep in Europe, we've had Hitlerism, we've had the Spanish fascists and the Italian fascists, among others, and we don't pay the attention to Mussolini as we do to Hitler and Spain, which is surprising in the sense that the heirs of Mussolini are actually in government now, and you know that isn't raised very often either. But the one thing I would ask is, what role did the mafia groups have in all of this as well? Because I know one of the things that Mussolini tried to do was to undermine the mafias because they were taking away his, you know, best interests. So was there any involvement from the mafias, or was that something that happened later on?
Right. So 2 points here. On the point of mafia, no, there was no role in the Matteotti thing because mafia was in Sicily, and everything that happened with the murder of Matteotti was in Rome, and it was really a political crime. These people of Dumini, this band, this political police, were all loyalists of Mussolini. They mostly came from Milan. They were Arditi del Popolo. It was a group that fought in the First World War. They all met during the First World War. They were very violent and very ardently fascist. So yeah, it was really the fascist violence that killed Matteotti. And sorry, I forgot your earlier point.
Oh, Peter, you're muted.
Oh yes, I remember now. Sorry. Yes, I think we should talk more about Mussolini. Mussolini was the first European dictator. It was the first modern dictatorship of the 20th century. He was extremely influential over Hitler. He was extremely influential for all the right-wing dictatorship that developed in Europe ever since. you can just think that the word fascism exists in all dictionaries of the world, and it comes from the movement of Benito Mussolini. It's a political category which was invented in Italy. So, indeed, extremely influential.
Thank you very much indeed. And thanks, Peter. Good questions. I'm going to bring Tim in now. I think, Andrea, if I can bring in, there's three people. If I can bring them in one after the other, then you can address the questions when they've all spoken. So I'm going to bring Tim in first and then Steve Freeman.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for a very interesting presentation. I've been married to an Italian lady since the 1960s, and my wife's grandfather was a deputy for the Socialist Party in the Italian Parliament in 1922 and 1924. I think he may have been in 1919 as well, but he was fighting the Austrians until the end of 1918, and I'm not sure how quickly he got mobilized. Well, anyway, he got elected and re-elected a couple of times, even with Mussolini in power. He continued as an MP, but then in 1924, the local fascists in Syracuse, where he represented, they just turned up on the day of the election. They closed all the polling stations. Then they filled the ballot boxes with votes for Mussolini's candidates, and that was the way that happened. So my wife's grandfather then retired to being a lawyer, withdrew from politics. In 1946, he was elected to the Costituente, the Constituent Assembly, which wrote the Republican Constitution of Italy. There were 75 of them. Right. And then he was elected and re-elected to Parliament, representing the PSD, the Democratic Socialist Party, which was if you like, the right-wing split from the PC. And that was a bad choice. He should have stayed with the PC, because in 1953 he lost his seat. But anyway, he...
what was his name?
Di Giovanni, Eduardo Giovanni. But you can look him up afterwards if you like. Anyway, I just would like to say that's the reason why I'm so interested in all this. And in fact, he was alive until the age of 103, and he used to tell us interesting stories of what went on in politics in the 1920s and so on. Just one more thing which I'd like to mention, this in answer to someone else who I think it was Phil, who wanted to know what happened to the Socialist Party, the PC, well, in the 1990s. And I think the answer to that is it's all to do with Bettino Craxi. And well, that's the reason that they dropped from 15% support to virtually nothing. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you once again for everything.
Thank you, Tim. I can mention very briefly to you that your grandfather was probably a colleague of Matteo Matteotti, the son of Matteotti, that was an MP in the PSD in those same years.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Tim. Wow, that's
very fascinating.
Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to bring Steve Freeman in now.
Thank you, Andrea, for a really interesting, enlightening talk. It's very, very inspiring. I don't want to say why we were drawn towards this subject. So, in a way, myself and Phil were drawn towards this subject for two reasons. Partly because Phil lived in Italy and knows a lot about Italian politics, but mainly because we were interested in this connection between having a king and ending up with fascism. What was that link? Unlike Germany, which was a different scenario altogether, with the Weimar Republic, as it were. And so we thought let's find out more. We didn't know. Well, Phil knows a lot more about this than myself. But anyway, I was interested simply to work out what is this relationship. And it seems to me the king was the enabler of all of this. And it's because we like to use the word kingly powers. Now, kings can have kingly powers. But President Hindenburg in Germany, he had the kingly powers. You know, those powerful executive powers that allowed Hindenburg to lift up Hitler to office, but it also allowed, obviously, Victor Emmanuel to boost Mussolini. But presumably, he thought Mussolini would protect the monarchy from these popular socialistic, communistic movements that had just been defeated or had been occupying many of the factories.
Kept him in place throughout the Matteotti crisis. He was instrumental to defend the government. There is, though, some evidence that perhaps the king, during that summer, was not so sure what to do. And I don't have time to discuss which evidence there is, but there was a long gap in between the Aventino secession and the first time the king spoke. There is this couple of months in which it's not clear whether the king was on one side or the other. And, you know, it's still something that is matter of historical investigations. What is, of course, known is that the king was instrumental also to take Mussolini down in 1943 when he asked to arrest Mussolini. And this was because he was losing the war, though, not because of any of the crimes that he had done before. And we also know that a large reason why Italians voted for the Republic is because they blamed it on the king, fascism, and the war. So eventually paid for his mistakes. But definitely very important to understand his role in that crisis, and still documents need to be coming.
Can I just make a supplementary? Because I had a slightly supplementary, but I'll keep it very quick. You know, we often say in this country, you know, every socialist is a Republican almost by definition. You know, you take it as given. You don't want to see a monarchy. But we also know that in England, people don't take Republicanism seriously. It's something that you say, well, of course, under socialism, we won't have a monarchy, you know, but for the moment, we don't need to do anything about it. So I'm taken back to that period to say, did the socialist movement ever take seriously? And you hinted that they didn't. So their republicanism was kind of for speechifying maybe, but not a real practical politics. They didn't, it seems to me, confront in their politics, or did they? That's a question. Well, did they confront this question by saying Italy needs a new constitution, needs a new republican system of government? Or were they simply arguing you know, that we should fight for socialism here and now? I mean, you know, if that makes sense.
I'll take another couple of questions and then I'll come back to this.
I'm going to bring in Mike because he hasn't asked a question yet. Mike Davis.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much, Andrea. Good to see you again at other Europe is Possible gatherings that we'd have brief conversations at. Dangerous times now, much more dangerous than the 2016-19 period when we were chatting away. I found the talk really fascinating, and I think it should be written up. And certainly with the magazine I had, be happy to publish something around that topic. I'm interested to know what I imagine the United Socialist Party, of which Matteotti was the leader, had an anti-monarchy, pro-republican position. And I wonder what was the fate of the party after his death. You talked a little bit about it, and I just wondered whether they were able to continue for very long under Mussolini's rule. And secondly, you kind of brought us up to date with the reference to Maloney and how she has refused to accept that Mussolini may have been behind Matteotti's murder. And I wonder if you might comment, if there's anything to comment, whether she has flirted with the idea of any kind of rehabilitation of of the monarchy, or whether today's sort of far right in Italy are going on a sort of different track. They don't really see that as significant. But we can see similar moves across Europe, and some of the far right talk about returning some sort of monarchy. But I just wondered in Italy what the situation is with the brothers and her party. Anyway, again, thanks very much for the talk.
Thank you, Mike. And I'll take another one.
Yes, Mike Hope wants to come back in.
On the question of did the king have knowledge, there's also the associated question as to some of the big industrialists like the Agnelli family, and how much they were giving the covert green light to Mussolini to do what he needed to do to silence critics, nasty, pesky leftists who encouraged the occupations of factories. But my question was really going to be around, very typically for a lot of the 20th century, the right has used the South against the North in Italy. And really this, until the advent of the Northern Leagues in the 90s, it was very much, the conservative South being used to sort of limit the more left-wing North, Bologna, Red City, etc., etc. I know Bologna quite well. But then, of course, the North, the Veneto itself became an extreme right-wing area. So some comment on the way that regions have been used against each other by the right, and indeed, the way the left has used them too.
Good question, Mike. Do you want me to bring in Phil, Andrea?
Well, yes, and then I start trying to answer. It's quite a lot of things.
It is, yeah. Okay, I'll just bring Phil in.
Now, I think I just want to make a general point about monarchs. I mean, they are facilitators of fascism. And I think the fact that our country has so little control over its monarchy means that in any state of emergency, the monarch can more or less sign off anything it wants. We just heard about how much money they've got, which we didn't know about, and the fact that their little side point, they can take money off pensioners, but they don't seem to be able to tax the monarchy. So I would say one couple of things about Vittorio Emanuele. He committed two acts of absolute perfidy for the Italian people. One was, as you mentioned, the giving Mussolini power, which he didn't have to do. Another would have been the failure to call a state of siege or emergency, and the army would have moved against the fascists. I think at that point there was enough support for the Italian state for it, as it stood, to do that. And the third one, of course, was the passing of the race laws, which he signed off in 30 seconds flat in exchange for a huge holding near Pisa, where he was installed and left for the rest of the war. So the guy was bought off, basically, and just tells you all you need to know about monarchs. That was all I really want to say. And thank Andrea again for a marvellous talk.
Very much, Phil. So can we go back to you, Andrea, to answer some of those questions? Could I just bring in one more question here? You mentioned the American fascists and the oil deal. I'm really interested in that as well.
All right. Okay, I try because it's now it's really a lot. Okay, so on the topic of how Republican were the socialists in Italy, well, I would say more than the Labour Party is now, but way more, way more. It was an integral part of the narrative. It was a policy point. It was raised in the country and in Parliament, and indeed they were obtaining reforms. They abolished the prorogation 100 years before. And prorogation is still in existence in this state, no? So they did something. They brought about changes. Of course, more had to happen if they had gone in government, but they never did because fascists came over. So I would be kind to the pro-Republican stance also because they were loyal to it, and then I can get to the point raised by Mike Davis about how did they get on after Matteotti's murder. Well, they all went abroad. Parties were, disbanded. Gramsci was in prison. Turati, the old leader of the Socialist Party, went abroad. They organized the resistance from abroad. And of course, when the actual military resistance started in 1943, they all came back and fought against fascism. But the socialists and communists were the driving force of the Republican campaign during the referendum in 1946. The referendum famously won, the Republic famously won in the North, which was, Mike Hope was mentioning, was progressive, the North, and they were voting for the Republic, whereas the conservative South was for the monarchy. So Pietro Nenni, the socialist leader after World War II, was a very passionate advocate of the Republic. So I think history will judge them kindly on that stance. Meloni will not rehabilitate monarchy though, because they are still angry that the king removed Mussolini from office. So the fascist tradition has never really rehabilitated the monarchy. And so there you go. No one really talks about the monarchy anymore in Italy, partly because they are absolute joke, but partly because of these historical elements. Mike also asked whether the king had knowledge and how much did industry people know. I mean, what I described in the aftermath of the murder was what people were discovering day by day. Of course, Matteotti was kidnapped. No one knew exactly what had happened, but it was very suspicious because he was the opponent of Mussolini, gave a speech against Mussolini. Then they arrest the guy that gave the car was a fascist newspaper. It was the Dumini. Everyone in Rome knew was a guy that was violent and was going around and beating up people. So, it was really a suspicion that was growing on Mussolini. Did the king know? We don't know, but certainly he suspected it. And so did all the other powerful people. Of course, the conservative South is not conservative anymore, or at least perhaps not more than the North. Things have changed significantly there, but you can still see that Italy is there are strong geographical tensions between the North and the South. At the moment, we are discussing in Italy the idea of giving more power to the regions and more money to regions, and there is a lot of discussions. The autonomia differenziata proposed by the Northern League is fought against by the progressives because progressives fight for equality across regions as well. So yes, regions are pitched against each other by the Northern League, but the rich region, but the left is fighting against. On Phil's point that monarchs are facilitator of fascism, I think it depends. In different countries, different stories. In some cases, it was slightly different. The Italian monarch was the first to face fascism. He has extreme responsibility. You mentioned, I mentioned the talk. The king, didn't sign the Stato d'Assedio, the siege. He gave Mussolini the power. He passed the racial laws. I would add the imperial crimes of Italy, in Ethiopia, in other countries. The king was the emperor then, and he is to be blamed for those crimes. Italy used very terrible weapons, bombarded people from above. I could go on and on Italian.
He got given the
crimes.
title of emperor in exchange for letting Mussolini in, didn't he? If I remember right.
Sorry, yeah. I didn't quite get what, but I think you're right.
He got given the title of emperor.
Yeah.
To flatter him in exchange for not criticizing Mussolini.
Exactly. But I would also, I think the history will be very unkind with the Italian monarchy. I would also add though that the late Queen, signed off the prorogation of Boris Johnson. Yeah. Of course, she pretended that she wouldn't do anything about it because she's not political, but the fact that it's not political doesn't help, because if there is no one that can prevent a prime minister to do something illegal, it's still a problem. Yes, right? So the fact that she's apolitical is a problem. And on Carol's point about the American oil business, I mean, this is very fascinating to me because he has this triangulation between Italy, London, Mussolini, and Matteotti. We still don't quite know, but it's quite peculiar, this fact that Matteotti's last piece of writing was in London on a magazine of the right, of the closest person to Winston Churchill. Brendan Bracken, among other things, was the founder of the Financial Times. So he was in all these economic circles, and you know it's quite a story that still we are digging, and I'm currently writing something with other people about exactly what happened there. I did write already something, and I will pass it on in the chat on the conversation last April on the anniversary of Matteotti's visit to London. But I'm very happy to write on the chartist as well because there is a lot of stories and sub-stories, and I just need to find the time to do all these things. But I would love to write about it, particularly about the Matteotti-Churchill-Bracken connection that I think is something that no one knows about and we still don't understand quite fully.
Well,
I
thank you
hope I
very
didn't
much.
miss any question.
No.
No, I don't think you did. If anybody wants any more clarification, they can raise their hand now if they'd like to. But this is all so fascinating. Because as you said, Andrea, Mussolini was the inspiration for the other. Well, that's the word. The word fascism comes from Italian, of course. So he was the inspiration. So this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your talk and for answering our questions as well. I think all I need to do is say thank you to Andrea, thank you to everyone else for coming along to this meeting and asking your questions and making your contributions. Enjoy the rest of your evening.